can we build the perfect room, Martin? If I send you $2 million and I have a bare piece of land, can I build the perfect room?
Practically, but not completely. I think that's where we ended up.
Yes. Okay.
There's no such thing as perfect.
So now, so that sucks, right? How do you sleep at night? Since your job can never be absolutely perfect.
It barely sucks because it's mostly all good. 99.9%.
99.9% is good. So we have here now 360 people in this room who are not in a $2 million room. I mean, maybe one of them is. If you're in a $2 million room, send me a postcard. But they're in rooms that are small, probably the wrong dimensions and stuff like that. And so my idea inviting you here is to provide some pointers and some ideas on how to make those rooms suck less.
Yeah.
So I read on Gear Slots, which is where all the good advice is given, that I have to put foam in the corners because that foam is really, really great, and stuff like that, and that egg crates on the walls work great too. Yeah, I heard that that works. So to simplify the workflow, what can people do? Let's structure this. First, what is the best place to put a pair of speakers in a small room?
Well, yeah, let's start there because that's a good starting point. What is the relationship between yourself and the speakers? First of all, you go in a lot of spaces and people put the speakers up for whatever reason, to make room for more video monitors or what have you. And they end up positioning themselves and the speakers in kind of the wrong location. Mm-hmm. In an ideal setup, that relationship between the left and right speaker and yourself should be pretty much an equilateral triangle.
Okay.
Right. So the distance between the left and right speakers is the same distance as the left speaker to the listening position and the right speaker to the listening position.
Question.
Yeah.
Does it matter should we just put our speakers wherever it looks good? Or should we have 18 feet in between the speakers and we stand 18 feet away from the speakers? Or should we be 1 foot from the speakers and then 1 foot apart? How do we decide that?
Well, 1 foot apart probably would not be a great idea.
Okay.
Yeah, because it takes, a speaker that has multiple drivers, it takes a little bit of space for that sound field to properly form. Mm-hmm. 18 feet apart. The only reason you'd put your speakers 18 feet apart if it was a large room and you're trying to cover an 18-foot wide recording console with a reasonable amount of response from the left to right side. So that being said, that doesn't exist in your home studio. You got kind of a work surface and some stuff, and you're really not moving a lot from left to right. Mm-mm. So imagine this, a speaker with good uniform off-axis response should be pretty similar when you're lined up in front of the left speaker or lined up in front of the right speaker. But outside of that, it's going to start to fall apart. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, you want to be positioned somewhere inside of those two left and right limits. So the left and right position of the speaker from the center line determine the width of the listening position. Okay. If the speaker has good off-axis response.
Did you guys hear that? Guys, it's not where they look good. It's rarely where they look good. The feng shui is important. I'm all about feng shui. Look, I have a pink light on my back wall. So that tells you just how much feng shui matters. But what matters is your relationship to the speakers and the relationship from the speakers to you so that you're comfortable within your workspace. So for example, I was going to log in from my phone, but since everything is freaking broken, here, my speakers are 5 feet apart. I'd say 4.5 feet apart, and I'm standing 4.5 feet from my speakers. And that was dictated by the fact that that's the size of my desk. So most of your position is going to be dictated by the size of your desk or the size of your workspace, right? Do you see that a lot in rooms?
Yeah. So that's kind of like, the guiding principle. If you're laying out a room from scratch, You know, you're looking at, okay, what is the effective listening area that you need to accomplish what you need to accomplish, and that will determine, you know, the size of that equilateral triangle and the distance you are away from the speakers to a large extent.
So, for example, if you're trying to have two people be able to listen at the same time, you're going to put your speakers wider apart.
Yeah, you need to create a little bit more room. So you need to have bigger space, all right, to accommodate that.
But for a single operator, that is just one dude making music, what do you see is the space, the triangle? What's the side of the triangle that you find is optimal these days? With
depending on the room, probably somewhere between, say, 4.5 feet and 7 feet.
Okay, between 4.5 and 7 feet.
Yeah, a part and parcel of this too is also getting the speakers in the right relationship to the desk. You know, what you see a lot of times, you have, you know, this studio furniture that has, you know, a kind of a shelf on the front side of it, and, you know, people tend to put the speakers on that shelf. Like you see it in every, you know, photograph of a recording studio with these near fields sitting on the meter bridge of the console. It's a well-established fact that that's not a good idea.
No, it sucks.
Yeah, you pretty much guarantee that, you know, you're going to hear the speaker, but you're going to hear the reflection off the work surface as well, which comes into play. If you can position those speakers on stands in front of that work surface, you're going to a large extent, eliminate the desk reflection, which is very helpful. So,
right, guys, this is super crucial. Check this out. It's not because our wonderful and beloved furniture manufacturers put a shelf for your speakers on their desk. It's not because it's good for the acoustics. It's because it looks nice and it's going to be easier to sell you the desk. So what Martin just said is, like, you should have the speakers behind the desk on stands, and that will help acoustically a lot. And I cannot begin to tell you the difference it made when I moved my monstrous SM9s from the desk shelves to the Argosy stands with isoacoustic thingies on them, and world difference, like unbelievable difference. So that's a very important thing. I see a lot of people making that mistake. You heard it from a professional, not from me, from a real professional right here. Do not use those shelves. On those shelves, you could put your Grammys. That's what they're for.
Right.
Put your Grammys on the shelf. Keep the speakers on stands. Okay.
Yeah.
So I hear a lot of stuff about corners being bad for speakers. What do you say?
That's kind of a loaded question because it depends on the situation. When you take a speaker, you know, and you got to assume the speaker is essentially an omnidirectional source at low frequencies. You know, there's just as much bass behind the speaker as there is in front of it. Right. So when you take that source and you start to bring it close to a room boundary, what you're doing is, you know, creating a secondary wavefront from that room boundary. So you got the bass leaving the speaker, you got the bass traveling behind the speaker, hitting the room boundary, and also traveling back towards you. Right. And that distance that you have between the speaker and the boundary that determines at which frequencies it's going to add and at which frequencies it's going to subtract. Bottom line being,
let me translate that, because you know so much and your brain goes so fast that the way you described it, some people may have missed it. Let me explain to you guys again. Check this out. This is the most important thing in the history of the known acoustics universe. Check it out. If you have a speaker here and you have a wall here and you're here, your ears are going to hear the sound from the speaker, and then your ears also going to hear the sound from the sound hitting the wall and coming back at you. All right. So if your speaker is here, you're going to hear this, and then you're going to hear this, and then this. The combination of the reflection from the wall and the direct sound may be in phase or out of phase. If it's in phase, it's going to get louder. If it's out of phase, it's going to cancel itself out. That is the crux of the problem. Martin, keep going.
Okay, so as you move the speaker close to the room boundary, you get this, path length difference between the speaker and the wall. As you get closer and closer to the wall, you pick up energy, mostly energy gain and less cancellation.
Yep.
If you look at the traditional recording studios, we take those large studio monitors and we flush mount them into the wall.
Yep.
When they get
Softix.
when they get flush mounted into the wall, what happens is, if that wall is the low frequency boundary, is it confines the energy to half of its normal space, which means you get double the low frequency energy in front of the speaker, which means when you calibrate it, you can reduce the amount of energy going to the amplifier and the amount of energy going to the speaker and still get the same amount of low frequency energy. Now, because the speaker's flush with the boundary, there's no path length difference. It's just straight gain.
And so there's no cancellation.
Right. But once the speaker is in front of the wall, as it starts to get in front of the wall, at certain distances where the fraction around the speaker hits the front wall, it starts to show up as gain and cancellation.
Which is why, guys, you sit at your mixing position and your mix is like so good. Like, I mean, so you hear it and it's awesome. And you take it from your phone, you go to your car and you listen to it, and there's no bass when you listen to your car. And your brain hasn't changed, your ears haven't changed between the moment you were sitting in front of your desk and the moment you sat in your car or listen on your phone on the headphones. The difference is where you're sitting at your desk. If you there's probably a boom or a cut. The opposite could be possible. You listen to your mix at your desk and it's awesome, right? And you listen to it in your car and it's all bass. It's because where you're sitting at your desk, you have a big null, a big hole in bass due to what Martin just explained. As you move your speakers away from the wall, it starts creating weird interaction between the direct sound and the reflections. And then all of a sudden, you can't hear shit, technical term, at your mixing position. That's why translation is horrible. It's not your speakers, it's the room and where the speakers are in the room. This, my friends, is the best known secret in the home studio universe. Every room I go in, and I go into a lot of rooms to visit Puremixers or to make records when I travel and everything. Every time I sit down in front of those speakers, I put the music I know and I go. And then I find one spot where it's like, okay, this sucks less, and this is where I am. And 90% of the time, the speakers are in the wrong spot. So corners are bad because they combine all those issues, right?
Well, corners, we're talking about, the interaction of one boundary. As you move speakers into the corners, introduce interaction from two boundaries, right? The front wall and the side wall. Now, imagine this. If you have the speaker, say, a certain distance from the front wall, and you have the speaker that same distance from the side wall, that path length difference where it causes gain and cancellation is going to be the same from two surfaces, which is going to make it even worse. So, ideally, if you're going to have a speaker near room boundaries, you want to have kind of an aharmonic relationship. That means, a relationship where those dimensions are not harmonically related, so that you can try to even them out.
Yep.
Right. So, as you put the speaker tight into the corner, the energy confinement there is going to basically just give you lots of gain at the low frequencies. Right. But as it moves slightly away from that corner, it's just going to create all kinds of other issues.
But a lot of gain at low frequencies in a small room is it's a big problem.
Yeah, because now you're basically radiating that low frequency energy into 1/4 of its original space. Right, so you'll have when you have introduce one boundary, you get about 3 dB gain of energy. When you introduce the two boundaries, you get about 6 dB gain of energy. Right, so
and that energy has nowhere to go.
Right,
because like this room was built. You haven't worked in this room. This is my confinement quarantine room. It's the room you saw downstairs on the 3rd floor, the pretty one with the shiny red stuff. So in this room, I built it before I knew you, but I know that once you put the energy in the room, the number one game is to try and prevent it from reflecting, right? And so to trap it, which is why the more bass trap, to an extent, the more bass traps you have, at least that's what I think, that's what I thought, is the better off you are. So I trapped the corners, and I trapped all corners, and these. Hold on, let me see if I can do this. Well, this up there, can you see that?
Yep.
This qualifies a corner. It's a corner between the ceiling and the wall. and there's that trap there, and then I can't do more. There's that trap there, and then there's a big trap in the back right behind me there. And these are well, we can discuss what's in there. You know, you're the specialist, and we got for a room that's 15 by 12. I work in here. I mix records in here, and it sounds great. Now I'm sure you have some comments on that.
Yeah, I mean, there's the first thing that we're talking about is what we call the boundary interference, and that's just the relationship of the speakers with the listening position and the relationship of the speakers to the room boundaries that cause this kind of gain and loss depending on what that is. Mm-hmm. The next part of the equation is, we're not just listening with, a couple room boundaries and a speaker in a listening position. We're listening inside an enclosed space. We're listening inside of, a box. Mm-hmm. So the next, issue deals with is what is that box doing in terms of how the sound field is created in that space. Now, mm-hmm. when you have these room boundaries that, confine this space, there's going to be certain wavelengths that fit equally in that particular dimension. And when that occurs, they create a very specific pressure pattern. And this, mm-hmm. Everybody's going to be familiar with this being what we call the modal response of the room. Mm-hmm. And what the modal response of the room does is when you energize the room, based on where these resonances occur, whether between, a pair of surfaces, which we call an axial mode, or two pairs of surfaces, which we call a tangential mode, or all six surfaces, which we call an oblique. Where these particular resonances occur, they have a very specific pressure pattern. So, to give you some example, if we look at the axial mode associated with the length of the room, so that means where we have, the room being a given dimension, and we have one wavelength that fits in that direction. Mm-hmm. Where that one wavelength fits in, it creates a pressure pattern that has a big null right in the center of the room. The pressure builds up at the front, and it builds up at the back, and then it drops right in the center. So imagine you have a room of a given dimension, you have your speakers set up and boundary and that, but it happens to put that listening position right in the middle of the room. Well, you give yourself a situation now where you're sitting right in the null point of that particular frequency. So just as a general rule, we try not to put the listening position anywhere near the middle of the room to avoid that. Now, what happens is that 2 times the frequency, you get a dip in front of that and a dip behind it, but it's back in the middle. Mm-hmm. At 3 times that frequency, you have 3 dips, with the dip being back in the middle of the room again, and in front and behind, and so on. Same thing happens with the width. Same thing happens with the height, and the pressure pattern that occurs, is associated with each type of mode. So, to that point, I just want to make another observation. If you have a room that's really well sound isolated, you have a much bigger problem, because the more the energy the room contains, the more pronounced that variation in the pressure response of the room is going to be. If you have a really highly isolated room.
Did you guys get that? This is super key. If you have angry neighbors and you built a bunker, you're trying to isolate the control room from the live room, right? You're basically building really good walls with the right sandwich and the right thing, and they're really thick and they stop the sound, which means all the energy stays in the room as opposed to exit the room. And that is great because you don't have to argue with your family or your neighbors. However, the tighter the room, the better the build, the more difficult it is to make it sound good.
Yeah, I just give you some sense of what that looks like in a really well isolated rectangular room. That drop in the mode, is in the range of 25 or 30 dB in the pressure field, if you can imagine. Now, if you have a bedroom and you haven't isolated your bedroom very much, well, that's going to work in your favor. Everybody else, around the house is going to enjoy some low frequency, but that low frequency that leaves the room is less low frequency you have to deal with.
And that, guys, crucial.
Yeah, and there's some variation too. If you're in, say, Europe, for example, where a lot of residential construction is done with masonry or concrete, you have rooms that are actually built out of heavier construction than they would be in North America, which are typically light frame wood construction, right? So it's a different scenario that you have to deal with. when you have this situation, where you have this pressure response to these different modal resonances that are occurring, one way of dealing with one of the kind of traditional method, which has been looked at a lot, is, hey, how can we vary the ratio of dimensions? Is there an ideal length to width to height where the onset of these resonances are spaced out evenly and are more favorable? There's been a lot of research on that, and a lot of merit to that. In a lot of situations, though, you don't have the option of changing the width or the length or the height, but it's still good to be aware of where these particular resonances occur.
But you can assume, because I know our people, I know the Puremix guys. Most people, a high percentage, are working in rooms that are set. Like me, you saw Flux. Right? Flux is made out of rooms that were apartments, or that were or that were built the wrong dimension. There's no way we're going to do construction to change it. So let's imagine that we cannot do construction. What can we do?
First thing is, identifying where these particular anomalies are occurring, and that you can, put low frequency energy up, put up things in a move around room and see, okay, I'm noticing a problem here, here, and here. A more quantifiable way would be to use some type of measurement platform. And there's a lot of really great ones that are accessible, which, if you're using a Mac or something, it would be like a fuzz measure, or also a Room Q Wizard is a great tool for people to.
And it's free too.
And it's free. And actually, that one has a room simulation tab on it where you can it'll put your room size in. It's going to calculate the room modes for you and show you at which frequencies they occur, which is going to be a handy tool. So the trick is, how do we damp those things? So now it means, adding some type of acoustic treatment to achieve that. And there's lots of products available. One thing that you got to keep in mind is when you're trying to absorb sound, the conventional way of absorbing sound is to have the air particles pass through some type of porous material, right? And it's the air particle moving back and forth through the porous material that basically converts that to heat. And if it's being converted to heat, it's taking energy out of the sound wave and it's giving you absorption. So bear in mind, though, this requires the air particle to be moving back and forth. When you get close to the room boundaries, where's the air particle moving? So what happens more at the room boundaries is that you're seeing an increase in pressure and not the actual particle movement. So for a absorber to work at the room boundary, you want something that's going to react to pressure, not necessarily particle velocity.
Okay.
So here's where something that's going to be diaphragmatic, because as the pressure builds up, the diaphragm bends and it's absorbing the energy. Right?
So that's why those bass traps with membranes behind are more efficient at room boundaries.
Yeah, and a bass trap with a diaphragmatic absorber is going to be more efficient. It's going to give you more absorption within a minimal amount of space than a straight resistive trap. If I have an extra 12 feet at the back of the room to fill with fibrous material, that's great. I have a big low frequency absorber, but it takes a lot of space, because where the absorber is most effective at absorbing a sound, like a linear absorber, would be at quarter wavelength. So at the maximum, remember, where the particle is moving the most back and forth, that's where that type of absorber is going to be effective. So that means if you have to go to low frequencies, quarter wavelength of the low frequency is a big amount of space. That's just not practical. So that's why you see other types of resonant absorbers. And there's two basic types of resonant absorbers. There's a tuned cavity. Imagine like a pop bottle. You're blowing across a pop bottle, you get that resonant tone out of it. Well, that pop bottle is an absorber at that frequency. So that'd be like a Helmholtz absorber. It can be done with slats or with apertures of various types. And the other type would be a diaphragmatic resonator, which would be some type of vibrating diaphragm, right, which can tune to specific frequencies.
So
based on airspace depth and
So basically, what I did here, which is shutting a whole bunch of 705 and loose rock wool in a corner and making it look pretty, is basically not that useful.
Well, it's, it has some effect. It definitely reduces the energy, but not nearly as much as it could be if it was more tailored type of absorber to that.
And
right?
so, is it possible for a civilian, individual, non-professional acoustician like you to build our own diaphragmatic absorbers, or should we just buy stuff?
It's probably easier to buy diaphragmatic absorbers, and there are a number of really great manufacturers that make these types of products, which could be, move them into the room and put them in the right position, and it's going to help quite a bit.
Okay, and so what would those be? Like, what's an affordable one that people can try and see if it works for them?
I think you'd have to go online, just do a little kind of search, but if you look at GIK or Real Traps or companies like that that make, off-the-shelf diaphragmatic absorbers, it'd be a great place to start.
Okay. And then, so
or if you're a little more scientifically inclined, you could, if you look up the formula for a diaphragmatic absorber online, you could, have a little science experiment in your project studio, calculate the modal resonances, and then tailor a diaphragmatic absorber to those frequencies.
Okay. That sounds like a fun summer project or confinement project. So in the so guys, Martin just looked at my room upstairs, and we looked at it, and it was pretty good to start with, but he built a plan to make it not perfect, because that's not possible, but pretty close. So in that plan, the plan you sent me is in the corners. Which part of that? So we're going to build it ourselves. So where's the diaphragmatic part of that in this plan? Was there one or not?
Yeah. So the plan there was actually trying to load up the low frequency, like the front and rear corners of that room, bearing in mind that we weren't entirely sure which way the room was going to be facing in the final form, which is another discussion. But
we still don't know. We have to negotiate with the landlord that he can see us through this period. Then we'll see what happens.
Yeah. So there's a number of things, right? If we just backtrack a little bit, we started the discussion. What is the relationship between the speakers and the listening position? We established that. Then where should those speakers be in the listening position in relation to the room, right? Ultimately, you don't want to have the listening position anywhere near the center room, but to favor one end or the other. If you favor the length of the room over the width of the room, it's going to be much more beneficial. I get that question. So, should we set this room up sideways so it's wider than it is deep? Or should we set up lengthways so it's deeper than it is wide? The correct answer to that is to set it up lengthwise. So what that does for you is moves the back wall farther away from you. So that amount of energy has to travel a longer distance, and it's easier to deal with. Secondly, in just the timing of the room, which is another thing we should talk about, because we have the speakers and we have the listening position. If we have just a big hard reflective room, we have more than just the speakers. We have all the side ceiling reflections, everything else combining at the listening position to affect the response. So the idea is that early in time, we want to eliminate all the specular reflections, that all the direct reflection paths between the side walls and the ceiling that is between the speakers and the listening position. When we do that, early in time, all we're getting is the energy from the left and right speakers. So we're getting a more accurate reproduction, and we're getting imaging between the left and right speakers and a good sound stage. So there's this idea of suppressing all these specular reflections. In a professional control room, we achieve that with geometry, and we achieve that with treatment. And the other objective is to try to create this neutral listening environment that has a kind of very balanced decay. That means we energize the room at all frequencies, pink noise, and we shut that pink noise off. The decay of that pink noise is uniform from top to bottom. That means the high end isn't overly absorbed, the low end isn't rattling around, and everything's just very balanced. But early in time, the direct energy is just direct energy between the speaker and the listening position. And then after about 35 milliseconds, which is kind of the ideal, we have this onset of a very diffuse sound field. That means a very well mixed sound field that comes back from the back half of the room, which means the room isn't completely dead, right? We need to have a little bit of live surfaces in the room just to contribute to that. That doesn't happen in your bedroom studio because you don't have the physical distance to realize that. But I'm just kind of giving you a picture of what happens in a real control room.
Yeah. So you mentioned the specular reflection. If you put your speakers on a stand behind your desk, the desk becomes a reflective surface.
Right.
What does one do about that?
Well, if it has a shelf, and here's where the shelf is going to help you, it may block the reflection off the flat surface, the work surface itself. You see, just like a meter bridge does on a console. If not, you gotta look at other means of trying to minimize that desk reflection. I know in the past, some control rooms and some particular console geometries, we ended up with a console. We ended up tilting the recording console slightly to redirect the reflection below listening height. So you're always trying to look at all these different situations and try to come up with a solution that's going to solve it.
So a very shallow desk would probably be a better idea than a deep desk.
Yeah, certainly, because there's just less potential area that's going to interact with the listening position.
Yep. And that's the thing with this stuff is, like, even when you know it, it really freaks you out to know how everything interacts with everything and how the smallest tiny little thing changes everything. So so for people, and one more question. So you were saying that at the room boundaries, diaphragmatic absorbers are better than just resistive resorbers, which are the standard bass traps with just rock wool in them, correct?
Right, because those traps would have to be much larger to really be effective. Yeah. Now, just to that point, I just want to make another observation. When you have a resonant trap, like a trap that resonates like a diaphragmatic absorber or a Helmholtz resonator, it gives you a lot of absorption, but over a narrow frequency band.
Yep.
Whereas opposed to having 12 feet thick of fiberglass back there, that's going to be linear. It's going to absorb low frequency and everything up completely, but it's just not practical space-wise, right? But it's understanding that when you make these diaphragmatic absorbers, if you don't build them properly, you could actually make your problem worse because it could put the absorption where you don't want it and not where you need it. So
my first ever consulting with an acoustician, where I started learning about it, and he made me build an Helmholtz resonator for like something like 83 hertz. And I'm a saxophone player. I can't build stuff, but it was just me, and I bought some MDF and I toiled over it, and it looked like Picasso built the resonator. And I tried by putting it in and out of the room and measuring the room with Room EQ Wizard, and of course I hit the wrong frequency. Of course I hit the wrong. Yes, right, Graham. It was 88. It's just I'm like at that point I was like, you know what? I'm not built for this. It's really difficult to build those things just right. It's very difficult. So what can people do besides throw themselves out the window and just move on to do something else with their life? What is the low hanging fruit? What can they do first? What order should they think about these things?
Well, any of the kind of those manufactured diaphragmatic products, they're not that frequency specific. They're meant to operate over a range of low frequencies. So that, in that sense, they're really well positioned to do what they're intended to do. So it's getting the speakers in the right position, so you're getting the right imagery. Getting rid of all the specular absorbers. Not absorbers, reflections, pardon me. Let's just speak to that point for a minute, because we have we've got a rectangular space. We got our speaker set up in it, and we got this reflections off the sidewall, off the ceiling. So let's put some absorption there. Okay, well, what constitutes reasonable absorption? There's quite a number of products online, some of which work really great, and other ones not that great. My experience is if you have just a thin layer of foam, I call it decorative.
Yep.
And I've actually shown this to clients, where we've been in a situation and I'm measuring on our measurement platform, and I'm saying, okay, see this, I'm getting a sidewall reflection there, and we look, okay, I notice there's absorption there, and I take the foam off, and there's there's the reflection, put the foam back on, okay, and then I actually put a bunch of more absorptive material on the sidewall, and reflection gone. So
foam. I'm sorry.
Generally, a lot of acoustic products are all made to be like 1 inch thick, and 1 inch thick material. It sounds like you're doing something because you put it in a room and you say, "Oh, I can hear the sound is different. It's energy's been absorbed, but it's primarily just high frequencies."
Mm-hmm.
So we've done, during the process of constructing studios, we've taken a control room shell and we measure just the empty hard shell. And then we put in 1 inch of absorption. Okay, it's better, but still not great. We put in 2 inches of absorption. Okay, it's getting better. And then, you put in 3 inches of absorption, and now it's starting to get reasonable. So in my mind, anything short of 3 inches of absorptive material really does not do the job adequately to eliminate the specular reflection. So if you're, set on using like a foam product or something like that, you could put some other absorptive substrate behind it, fiberglass, cotton, what have you, and then put that foam on top of it. It's going to be much, much more effective.
Did you guys hear that? That is the key. Again, just like the desk, everybody has good intentions, and everybody is trying to find solution to the problems. And for them to keep on eating and sending their kids to college, they have to sell it. Because it is for sale and well marketed doesn't mean it is necessarily the best in the universe. It's really important to really pay attention to that stuff. So no, putting one layer of foam because that's all you can afford will not make the room better. But if you, for the same price, you can probably get 2 or 3 inches of 705, and that will help make the room better. You will also itch like crazy once you put it up, which is nice. It's an extra flavor. So that's great. So is it better to do? So of course we talk about the diaphragmatic absorbers. That would be the best, right? If you can afford to put diaphragmatic absorbers everywhere, that would be great, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Diaphragmatic absorbers in areas, where you're going to have that kind of pressure build up, and they're actually going to be able to do their job. You can put a diaphragmatic absorber in a location where it's not going to do anything. Right. So you want to do it where the pressure is going to be built up, and that's where that type of absorber is going to shine.
Yep. Okay. So now, fascinating. Let's talk about clouds. Let's talk about so because you said resistive absorbers are less efficient near the boundary, near the wall, right? They are better. They work better away from the wall where there's a lot of movement of particles. So where would you put a basic resistive absorber, and how would you use it?
Well, resistive absorbers do their job down, to below 100 hertz if you have the proper thickness.
Yeah.
Right. And their job is to eliminate the specular reflections. Right, or so we call the geometric acoustic frequencies. Where sound is behaving more like a ray than it is like a wave. Mm-hmm. At low frequencies, we're dealing with a slightly different phenomenon. So, if you want to look at a specular surface, a simple way of doing it is you sit at the listening position, put your speaker where it is, and you put a mirror against the wall. Can I see the speaker? Well, that's a specular reflection. If you're seeing a direct reflection path between these surfaces, and those are things that you want to have suppressed. So this would typically be the sidewalls, front wall, and front ceiling. Right. So speaking to your question of the clouds. Now, if you take a 3 inches of absorptive material and you can put it to the ceiling, it's going to do a good job. If you suspend it off the ceiling, it's actually going to make it work at a lower frequency, because now that fuzzy material is at a quarter wavelength lower frequency away from the boundary, right? So
Did you
If
guys
you
get
have the space to adjust the height, you should certainly do so. Yeah.
and that would be the same. That would be the same from the wall. So if you put your 3 inches right on the wall, it's one thing. But if you leave an air gap between the wall and your absorption, you get a better low end absorption. Correct?
Yeah, you're getting more free absorption at the expense of space in a room.
Yep. And so
Right.
so for people who are like trying to get an order of magnitude in their heads, so they managed to build a bass trap that has 3 inches of dance rock wool. Um, how would they decide how far away from the wall would they make it? If they're efficient.
If you're looking at just straight resistive materials,
Mm-hmm.
like rock wool,
Mm-hmm.
if you look at and you have say 3 inches of it, the amount of airspace behind it determines how much more efficient it gets at low frequencies.
Mm-hmm.
Where you take that airspace, that entire depth of that assembly, and you assume that's 1/4 of the low frequency wave.
Mm-hmm.
And that'll tell you the frequency that it starts to work at.
Okay.
Now, as you go lower in frequency, there's a lot more energy there, right? So it
Yep.
becomes, how much of this stuff can you put in? How effective it's going to be.
Mm-hmm.
And then, this is when it comes to, absorbing low frequency energy.
Yep.
Another kind of common mistake people assume is they have their, their room, let's call it your bedroom or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And they, draw this, rectangular space. You figure that that's this inert thing, that has no properties, and everything that you put into it is acoustic treatment. That's certainly not the case, because everything that sound field encounters is acoustics treatment to some extent, right? So like a lightweight construction gypsum wall on studs is basically, a diaphragmatic resonator to start off with, right? So everything is going to have these kind of properties to them. If you have like a 2-foot thick concrete bunker, well, then you can assume that it is more closer to an ideal, solid box.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yep. Guys, hold on. Let me, because I'm like multitasking with the chat. Guys, I wanted to prime, so together with Martin, because his knowledge base is so immense. Like we spent a whole day together in my room, and I learned a lot, and I thought you would enjoy that. So what I'd like to do now is start asking the questions, start asking Martin the questions that that you have put in this fantastic system. There's a poll. There are 2 polls. Polls number 1: have you tried SonarWorks or similar tools? Yes, no. And the other poll is: have you tried creating your own DIY acoustic treatment before? So yes, 50% basically for absorption. And then for the SonarWorks, it's a kind of a 50-50 deal. I can tell you from personal experience, and the SonarWorks guys are friends. They're awesome. SonarWorks can probably help to some extent. It helps great with headphones because it knows what the headphones are supposed to sound like because they analyze them. For a room, I've had less success with it because it creates first the workflow is difficult for me because you have to put in between your mix and your speakers. If you use several speakers or if you use headphones, you have to have different paths. It's a pain for me. But I think that in general, even if you're going to use SonarWorks to get to whatever sound you think you want, you should really think of treating your room first. Because if you're at the point where you have identified a problem that is bad enough that you are going to use a piece of software to try and fix it, that means that your room really needs a lot of help. That's my feeling about it. But I am right now using SonarWorks on these guys, my trusted focals, because they have a little bit of a bump in the low mids, and I'm using SonarWorks to fix that, and it's great. Let's see. First question upvoted by 21 votes. I haven't read it before, so I'm just going to read it off the cuff like this. What is the process of tuning a room from start to finish, and what type of tools I needed? Mix software, just good ears. How do you begin? This is great. How do you begin, and how do you know when you are finished? Let's make that the question. I think that's key. How do you begin, and more importantly, how do you know that you're finished tuning a room?
Well, first of all, you have the room, you're listening to it, you're experiencing it, and you feel there's something not quite right about it, but you're not quite sure what it is. So the first place to start is having some means of quantifying it, right? It's trying to, okay, establish exactly what the problem is. And this is where some of these software packages are very helpful. So you can measure the response of the room, and you start to see what the issues are. Then the next step it would be to, okay, how do we correct that? Well, you touched briefly on trying to correct it electronically, which a lot of speaker manufacturers, a lot of people are moving in that direction, because it's something that can be implemented digitally, and it's certainly a useful tool to have in the toolbox, but it doesn't solve everything. Like one of the best corrective systems I've seen has been like Trinov, which is like a multi-microphone test capsule that measures everything and tells you quite a lot of stuff. And it uses an algorithm to correct for that, and it can make things better. Certainly.
Yeah, I know that very well. I tested it.
We have,
they're friends of mine. They're French people, but nice.
It's a great system. We had a situation where the professional control room, and they had a lot of low frequency problems. So they brought that system in and implemented it, and it did make it better, but they still were not satisfied with the end result. So then, they brought us in, and what we did, we took a look at that, and there were a lot of problems in the room, like the front window vibrating, this and all kinds of issues. So we ended up rebuilding the control room and doing quick calibration, and I said, let's bring that thing in now and see what it's doing. So we brought the Trinov back in, and it showed the responses, nicely flattened out from all the speaker channels. So, but what was interesting to me, it becomes illustrative of what is appropriate to fix electronically and what is best to fix physically in the room, which is getting to our next point. So, we measure, see what's going on, and we try to identify where the low frequency problems are in the room. With that information, we now can, come up with a scheme to improve the acoustic environment, right? What's required? Do we have any unwanted reflections? Do we need specular absorbers here? We have like build up a low frequency energy. Do we need to add more low frequency damping to the room? And all that stuff points you in that direction. In which case you start to, chip away at all these anomalies. And part of that process, though, is to use that measurement platform to quantify things, right? Okay, I just did this. Did it move the needle? Did it make a measurable difference? And that's what's important, is to try to understand what's making a measurable difference. When you're finished is when you get that response on that system as good as it can be.
Using the quantification method,
and then you have the confidence in it, because you can prove it to yourself.
All right, you heard it here. Thanks, Martin. Second most voted question. Hi, Martin. From Matt. Can there be too much absorption in a small room? And so part one, and second part, are multiple subwoofers the only real answer to smooth low end in a small room?
Can there be too much absorption in a small room? Probably, because if you have a fully absorptive small room, you're basically listening in anechoic conditions, which is not a natural way to listen to sound. So I would say certainly you can have too much absorption. Subwoofers are a tricky thing, especially in a small space. It's the hardest thing to calibrate properly. When you have the subwoofer calibrated properly and positioned properly, it should sound like there's no subwoofer. It should sound like you just got low frequency extension to the left and right speakers, and it sounds natural. You're not hearing something thumping away on the bottom corner of the room somewhere that's distracting you, right? So multiple subwoofers can be helpful, because you can have the subwoofer in one position, then that tends to be exciting one particular type of modal pressure pattern in the room. The other subwoofer could be positioned asymmetrically to that to fill in where that one creates a hole, and vice versa. So but now your calibration is twice as tricky as it was before. But
it's so hard.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So we looked that question. We had uh, that's the same question. That's the same question. Um, so a lot of the questions I see, um, here's yeah, a lot of the questions I see are about uncertainty, meaning when to apply acoustic treatment in what order, are corner bass traps recommended for along the ceiling wall to wall corner. um, Basically all these questions are how much absorption is too much. All these questions are related to not being able to have a benchmark, not being able to measure things properly. So what if somebody were, and I don't recommend everybody does this because it can get a little depressing, but if say if you get an RTA microphone, there you can get a Behringer one for like $50, so it's cheap, and you get Room EQ Wizard, and you start looking at your room. Um, how do you look at it? Like, do you look at the third octave, sixth octave, 12th octave? Um,
Yeah,
how can
that's
it be?
a great question. A lot of these platforms like Fuzz Measure and RoomEQ Wizard, they're that FFT kind of approach to showing the response, and you to crank up the resolution, and you're seeing this picket fence stuff going on. It's like, how are you ever going to deal with that? That's really not the way you necessarily hear it. I mean, that's very useful in understanding and seeing certain things. So if you could go more like 1/6 octave RTA type, it's going to give you the smoothing that's going to be more consistent with how you're going to perceive something.
Okay. So say somebody, so that would be a good start, guys. Most of
yeah,
your,
just
I'm going to
I
go
had
back
one
and
more
look at
point.
I'm
Just
sorry to
getting.
interrupt.
Oh, sorry. Just give me that point. Like, how much absorption is too much absorption in a space? How can I have too much bass trapping in the space? Well, here's a kind of general guideline. And, is you take that kind of measurement platform and you do a waterfall plot, right? You energize the room at all frequencies, and you look at the decay of all those frequencies across the spectrum. What you want to see is a fairly uniform decay. Now, that means, the high frequencies and the low frequencies are kind of decaying at the same rate. Don't make yourself crazy about this, though, because in a small space, it's going to be almost impossible to get uniform. So if you got a little bit more decay at low frequencies, it doesn't make you a bad person. So, but if you have a super long decay at a particular frequency, well, that's certainly one you want to go after, right? So, but the general change of decay from the top to bottom should be fairly consistent, fairly kind of even, right? So, if that's a good way to look at it.
Okay, so that's the first way to look at it. So you put your microphone at a mixing position on a stand. You run, you energize the room. You look at it at 1/6 octave resolution smoothing, and then you start looking at the decays, and then you're like, okay, I have my 60 hertz is hanging out 1 second longer than everything else, right? So what's your next step? What do you think?
Your next step is to try to target some absorption to that frequency range, right? So you can, damp that frequency.
Mm-hmm.
So this becomes a little bit of a game. It's like, how much absorption do I need? Well, if you look at, the simple equations for a diaphragmatic absorber, you take the surface density of the diaphragm and the airspace behind it. It's going to tell you the frequency that it's absorptive at. Well, that's great. I can design something for 60 hertz. It doesn't tell you anything about how much absorption you're getting. Are you getting 0.2 absorption, or are you getting 0.9 absorption? Right. So, I mean, there's ways of predicting that. It requires a little bit more mathematical rigor.
Mm-hmm.
But it could also be, you start putting in absorbers at those frequencies, and you measure it again. And you measure it again. At the end of the day, you want to have something that is quantifiable, and you want to have a measurement that's repeatable.
Yeah,
because that's how you get to the truth.
So that's the key, guys, and that's what I see most people not do, because it's a pain in the ass. So you build your absorption, and then what I see a lot of people do is like aim, build the absorption, put it on the wall, like fasten it to the wall solid, like it's in place, right? And then measure the room, and they're like, well, that didn't do anything, right? So there's a trial and error moment there, that it's important to not just go and fasten your beautiful pre-wrapped gorgeous bass traps or gobos on your walls before you go listen to it, or before you go actually ring it out. Tom and myself, before Martin came in, spent days taking this stuff in and out of the room and trying stuff. For years, I mixed with two gigantic pieces of wood in the corner with diaphragmatic stuff in the back. And then one day I was like, why am I doing this? And then I removed it, and my room got better. And then I tried to trace the why those things were in the corner. I was like, why did I put these things there? Because it looked good. It looked really good. So that's why I put them there. And they were a pain in my ass at 53 hertz or 54 hertz for 5 years before I was like, oh, get that stuff out of here. So it's really important to measure. And seeing Martin work was very interesting. You got to be super zen. You have to be super zen. You ring it, you look at the results. I cried. He was very zen. And then he started fixing it by just moving things around a little bit, and now I'm mixing it. Well, now I'm mixing downstairs, but when I mix upstairs, my just from moving the speakers, that's all Martin did at the first part until we were able to build what he recommended. Just moving the speakers made a huge difference. And I already had moved the speakers, but I had moved the speakers like this here, like we do in France. You look for the direction of the wind, and then poof, you put the things here. And I was doing, arguably could say I was doing pretty well. But since Martin came and he moved the speakers, things were way different, way better, much faster. So I get the same mixes, but I get them faster. And the difference between this and that was the measurement and knowing how to read the measurement. So you've already gotten some pointers on that. I can't wait to hear what the room is going to sound like when we're done with the stuff you spec'd. It's going to be really, really interesting. Let me find another question. Oh, I love this. Does hanging a guitar on the wall change the room a tiny, tiny bit?
Yes, because you can never have enough guitars.
There you go. That's not true. It's synths. You can never have enough synthesizers.
Or synths.
Yeah. A lot of people ask about tube traps. Those are diaphragmatic absorbers, right?
You have diaphragmatic absorbers. They're made to work with pressure, and you position. They're engineered to work that way. That's like a consistent way of having that particular product work. So it makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
One thing that we didn't touch upon, which may or may not be a question that people have, and that's the use of diffusers.
Let's talk about that.
In a space. Now, we've talked about bass drops, we talked about absorbers and things like that. Now, diffusers are a very useful product in terms of scattering sound energy. One thing people have to be mindful of, those diffusers are, do their job over a range of frequencies. Typically, the depth is going to determine the low frequency cutoff, below which it's not doing anything, and the well spacing is going to determine the high frequency cutoff, above which it's not doing anything. So most of the products you'll see are all kind of mid-range products. They're meant for the mid-range frequencies. And the idea is, you scatter sound in a space, and you end up with a more uniform energy density. That sounds really technical. But uniform energy density is like when you take any kind of unit volume in this corner of the room or the middle of the room or wherever you have it, the sound in that particular thing is uniform. So the sound is the same everywhere. So the sound field in the room is really well mixed. This is the idea of diffusion, and you could argue that, the more diffusion you have, the better the room, because the more uniform the sound field is going to be mixed in the room. And that is the whole idea. When you have the benefit of space and geometry, this is a powerful tool. When you go into a small home studio and you're not, say, too far away from the back wall and you put a bunch of diffusers on there, you may be disappointed because what happens is, for a quadratic residue type diffuser, a sequence type diffuser, it takes about 6 to 8 feet for that diffuser to develop a diffuse sound field. If you're not that far away from it, as you get close to it, you're getting a lot of specular reflections and phase and a bunch of other things that are not particularly helpful to you. So, one approach is to try to, in a small space, not put that type of treatment anywhere where it's going to be specular, anywhere, where it's a direct reflection path between the speaker and the listening position.
So in this room, putting a diffuser in the back would be bad because I'm 8 feet away from it.
Right. So if you're not far, and then people sitting on the couch back there would, probably not enjoy the sound of that too much. Because, but they have their purpose. If you can get them on the rear sidewalls where they're not a direct reflection path, or on the rear ceiling, they're gonna help give you some scattering in the room. But I would try it if you're gonna use that type of thing. Because a lot of times you traditionally see it on the back wall, because that's where you see it in recording studios. But in recording studios, that's 20 feet away from the next position. A lot of times. So that's why it works there. It doesn't work in your home studio.
How big would a diffuser have to be be able to diffuse in the bottom?
That's a very loaded question. So if you want to have a low frequency diffusion for the bottom, because we've actually built some of these with Peter D'Antonio back in the day, the depth of the diffuser is about 6 to 8 feet. So if you got a 6 to 8 foot depth to build this, a low frequency diffuser, that's great. But still, you need to be a good distance away from it to benefit from it.
Yep. Right? My good friend George Massenberg built a room like that in Nashville at
yeah, look at that room at Blackbird, and then that is going to show you what it takes to build a real diffuser.
It is madness.
Perfect example.
Have you been in that room?
Yeah, it's and I just want to point out that diffusion is the most expensive acoustic treatment.
Yep.
Right. It's it's just the materials and the assembly of it is the most cost prohibitive to make.
Yeah, that room. I've been in that room. I heard a couple of George's mixes in that room. It is insane. That room is insane. Did you get a chance to listen to that room?
I have not been in the room, but I know quite a bit about it.
Yeah, it's wild. All right, great. Let me see. There's a couple other questions. Let's see. What qualifies as a small room in your vision of things?
Let's say anything smaller than say 8 foot. Let's say 10 foot ceiling height, 14 foot width, 20 foot depth.
So basically, every room of everyone in this chat, pretty much.
Yeah. And and the smaller the space, the more challenging it becomes, right? Because you're just closer to all the room boundaries. So,
and that's the key that everybody has to understand. There are things called the laws of physics, and that are very difficult to bend. And so it costs a lot of money to bend the laws of physics, and so you cannot fight the laws of physics. And so it's really important that when you pick your next studio, fight for the bigger room, right? So what Martin said is 10 feet ceiling. Anything smaller than 10 foot ceiling, 8 foot wide and 14 feet deep is going to be, it's going to be a 20 feet deep. Sorry.
Yeah, 20 foot by 14. That's like let's get that create that as the limit.
So say 10 ceiling. I'm gonna put it there so people can see it. 10 ceiling. There you go. Mark is faster than things. That, my friends, anything below those dimensions is going to be considered a small room, and it's going to make your life complicated. So if you have the option, I don't. I'm in New York City. If you have the option, pick a room that's bigger than that, and you will spend a lot less money on absorption and acoustics and also antidepressors. But if you can't, then we just discussed for the last hour and 11 minutes and change a very interesting way of rationalizing it and not freaking out. which is, I think, really interesting. A lot of people are asking about active bass traps. But how do you feel about active bass traps?
I think active bass traps are a great idea. They have the potential to be very, very efficient and effective. One of the tricks is just getting the right quantity of them to to do the job, right? Because they can be 100% absorption, but if you don't have a lot of them, they're not accounting for a lot of the potential surface area of the room.
Yeah, we tried. I have a pair of PSIs that worked really good in this room, and we measured them in my room upstairs, and the room is too big for them. There was not enough of them for it to work. But I know they've worked great in this room because the concentration here, first the surface is about a third, and I know exactly where the pressure points are, and so those were great here. But then I stole them from upstairs thinking they were going to help, and then we realized when you came down that they did not help, which means that you must measure. The way it feels is not the way it is. Okay, a couple more questions.
Just to that point, Fab, I just want to point out, you can measure all this kind of stuff and you can make yourself crazy trying to get the perfect measurement. At the end of the day, it's going to come down to you sitting in that room and liking what you hear.
Yep.
Right. So,
see, that's the most important thing. 4 years, because I'm a nerd and slightly obsessive, a little bit on the edges, and I also hate not knowing things. It's a problem. Ignorance is bliss, I tell you. So, but I hate it. So I always try to do better and better and learn stuff. And when I started measuring the rooms I was in, I started being really like, there's no way. What am I doing here? It's like, what's the point? This just like a 10 dB peak at 60 hertz. There's a 10 dB holes at 120. It's just hell on earth, right? And so, so I started to get really upset with the rooms. So it's really important that if you're going to start measuring your rooms, that you keep a very relative notion and a very informal quality to it, unless you're willing to really go to town to fix the stuff and have the means to fix the stuff. Otherwise, you're just going to start get really sad. I know I got really sad for a while. And then after a while, I documented myself, and then I got better at it. And now I know even better because of you coming down. I will post results. Maybe we'll try and shoot a video of us, do measurements and shoot a video of before and after, and maybe you can contribute to the video so that people understand this a little bit better. But there's no way that my enlightened amateur knowledge base can replace the lifelong pursuit that you've followed to build the perfect room, the 99.99% room. Sorry. We have been here a while. Let me see if there's a new question that's been voted that is a value for us that we haven't really gone. We're not going to get. People are asking, should I just mix on headphones? Yeah, a good question. Should we just mix on headphones?
No, you shouldn't mix on headphones. You can get close on headphones. There's a kind of difference that happens between listening to speakers and listening on headphones. With headphones on, you can, intracranially, you can detect like, a millisecond difference in delay. Interaurally, from speakers, that 30, 40 milliseconds difference, right there is kind of a key indication that, the perceptive experience of listening on speakers is different than the perception you get on headphones. I mean, you can get close, but it's not going to be exactly the same experience.
Yes. So is there something that people can, personally, I found that I can do a lot on headphones, especially since a lot of people listen to music on headphones these days, but I cannot place vocals properly on headphones. I always make mistakes. They'll always end up being buried in the mix, like deep buried in the mix, even if I like the singer. Sometimes, you bury the vocal because the singer sucks. But most of the time, you try and, that's the focal point of the stuff. So to me, I find that having speakers is crucial to be able to place vocals. Also, it's great to be able to work with someone. If you have someone else in the room, everybody in headphones is impossible to work. You just can't. It's not the same experience. It's no fun, especially if you don't have the same headphones. It leads for very interesting conversations. Like, too much bass. I don't think so. Oh, right. Hold on. So what it is, because this right now, it's very difficult to buy a good pair of headphones that will not lie to you. It's quite difficult. Hence the success of SonarWorks. So I think that this qualifies as a lot of very good information that people are going to be able to watch over and over and over again. And we went over the time that I promised you it would take. So thank you so much, Martin, for taking the time to share your wisdom, endless wisdom, with us this hour. Sorry, everyone, about the problems at the beginning. The internet is broken, but I'm glad we were able to get back on track. I hope you all learned something, and I would like you all to give a big thank you to Martin in the chat there for taking the time from his home up in Canada to share the wisdom with us. And I will see you all tomorrow at 2:30 for a no holds bar, no net, live on camera, real-time mix with Luna. So it's going to be pretty heavy. Thanks again, Martin.
Okay, thanks. Fun hanging out with everybody.
Thank you. Talk to you soon.
Okay, bye now.